One of the questions I get asked a lot as a runner is, what kind of shoes do you wear? And oftentimes it's asked by someone who's just started to run and wants to know what kind of shoes they should buy. So in this episode, I will talk about what brand of shoes I prefer. I'll talk about what I like about that brand, some of the controversy surrounding that brand, and then lastly, we'll talk about the pros and cons of zero drop shoes. So if all that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned. So before I get started, I should probably offer a disclaimer that I am not a shoe expert, and just because a particular shoe or type of shoe works great for me does not mean it will work for you. And everybody's different in their running styles and what shoes might perform the best for them. It's even possible that following the advice in this video is known to the state of California to cause athlete's foot and acne and maybe intestinal discomfort or something like that. So keep that in mind. So when I started running about 9 years ago, I just picked up my nearest pair of tennis shoes that I had laying around. I think they were New Balance. Those in the East probably call them sneakers. Maybe some of you call them running shoes. I'm not sure. We just called them tennis shoes in the Midwest where I grew up. I didn't really do any physical activity prior to me starting running, so I didn't really have high standards when it came to shoes. But after I had been running for a couple of weeks, I started to look around for some new shoes. And my brother, who had recently got into running, recommended that I try a brand called Altra, which was fairly new at that time. Most of you probably are already familiar with that brand, but if you're not, it sounds like ultra as in ultra marathon, but it's spelled differently. It's spelled A-L-T-R-A. And there were two things that Altra was doing different than most other shoe companies at that time. And the one thing is that all of their shoes were zero drop, meaning that the heel and the forefoot are the same distance from the ground. And then the other thing they did different is all of their shoes had a wide toe box. And that's something that a lot of the other manufacturers weren't doing very well on most of their shoes. They had kind of a torpedo shape where the Ultra shoes were a little bit boxy looking in the front because they had this wide toe box. So I went and bought myself a pair of Ultras. I believe it was the Ultra Instinct. And I put my feet into those shoes and they really did feel different. The zero drop especially, it just felt odd compared to the shoes I had been wearing. When I started to run with them, I started to feel that my calves kind of felt stretched, like I was putting some strain on them. And so I kind of swapped between the Ultra shoes and the old New Balance until I got used to the Ultras, and then I went to them exclusively. And over time, I really started to like them. In fact, I wanted to get zero drop shoes for everything because when I went to the office or went to church, I had these shoes that were not zero drop and they felt funny to me. And so I started switching out all of my shoes with zero drop shoes. And for years now, the only non-zero drop shoes I've had are my muck boots, which I rarely wear, and my chest waders that I, again, probably wear once every couple of years when I go fishing. So I've been pretty much wearing zero drop all the time. Now, Altra more recently has called, instead of calling it zero drop, they've started to call it balanced cushioning. I think the reason for that is a lot of people were confused. When they see the word zero, they think minimalist shoe. And that's really not what Altra specializes in. Their shoes actually have padding. In fact, you can get Altra shoes that have a pretty thick stack height if you want them. I usually get like the medium cushioning. So it's not that they're making a minimalist shoe necessarily. They are simply making a zero drop shoe. Now, at any given time, I usually have about 3 pairs of shoes. So I have a pair of road running shoes. Usually those are the Ultra Torin. One time I got the Ultra Rivera, but the Torins are what I've kind of standardized on. And most of my running miles end up being in those shoes. But I also normally have a pair of racing shoes. And usually those would be like something like the Escalante or the Escalante Racer, or maybe the Ultra One. Back in the day, the Ultra One version 2.5 was a great shoe. I'm not sure why they did away with it. I would like to see something just like that back on the market. But those shoes I typically wore when I was doing speed work or tempo or some kind of workout, and then also the 5K and 10K races, even the half marathon distance. But once I get above that, even for racing, I would use the shoe that has more padding, like the Ultra Touring. And then the third shoe that I always have on hand is a trail shoe, and pretty much have stuck with Lone Peak. I really like those shoes, and they have served me well. Now, the question you might have about Ultras is, how durable are they? And my answer to that is, it depends. I've seen a lot of people say that they've had trouble with them breaking or wearing out quickly. And I don't know why people have that experience, but for me, Ultras work great. In fact, they're very durable. Almost all of my running shoes, I end up logging 1,000 miles or more before I retire them. I have a pair of Ultra Tourins here that I have 1,000 miles on. I've retired them now, but they have been excellent shoes. My last, I'm going to say 5 or 6 pairs of Tourins and Reveres have all lasted more than 1,000 miles of running. And this is GPS miles tracked on Strava. There's no mistake. These lasted more than 1,000 miles of running. I have here also a pair of Escalantes, and these have 1,100 miles. I'm still using these. I used them for the Thanksgiving Day 5K, but it's time for those to get retired. I have replaced them with a pair of Escalante Racers that just getting broke in at this point. As far as trail shoes, they typically last 800 to 1,000 miles for me, depending on how rough I am on them. I currently have a pair of Ultra Lone Peaks that have 950 or more miles on them, and they're just starting to split out a little bit up near the front, and so they will need replaced pretty soon. I think this just goes to show that different shoes work for different people. There's not one size fits all. Just because Ultras work great for me doesn't mean they'll work great for you. I don't know why they last so long for me. I think it probably has to do with the fact that I'm not all that fast. I tell people I have an old man shuffle. I have a short, choppy stride. That's probably pretty easy on the shoes because I don't put a lot of strain on them. And maybe there's something about the mechanics of my stride or the shape of my foot or whatever that causes them to work well. The other thing is that a lot of so-called foot experts say that you should retire your running shoes after 300 miles, or some say after 500 miles because, maybe you'll get an injury or something if you continue to wear them when they're partly worn out. But the fact is, I haven't had any real running injuries to speak of. Now, there have been a few injuries that have kept me from running, but generally they've been stuff that's happened when I've not been running. The major running injury I had that sidelined me for a while was I was running on pavement on a path, and it was snow covered, and I stepped off the edge and twisted my ankle a little bit, and that sidelined me for a couple of weeks. It wasn't anything that I had to go to the doctor for. I just needed to let it heal, and then everything was good. So if I had injury issues, I would probably swap out shoes a little quicker. You may have to, but I'm just saying that for me, I'm able to use them up to 1,000 miles without any trouble. Now, there's been some controversy recently about Ultra shoes because for the first time in their history, I'm going to say in the last 6 months, they've started to make some shoes that are not zero drop. And so kind of their identity of always selling zero drop shoes, they moved away from that, and now they have some shoes that are not completely zero drop. They're still low drop. I'm not sure exactly what the difference is, but they're not true zero drop shoes. And of course, they don't advertise them that way. Some people were very disappointed in that. I don't really have a strong opinion as long as they continue to make zero drop shoes, which is what I prefer. Whether or not they make other shoes for other runners, I certainly don't care. I question, though, whether from a marketing standpoint, if it's a good decision. I'm certainly not an expert in those things. But Ultra always had this identity that if you bought a pair of Ultras, it was always zero drop, always. You never had to worry about that. So I guess the question is the extra sales that they'll get from kind of widening their product line, is that benefit going to overcome the maybe loss of identity? I don't really know. I do know that obviously there are tons of shoemakers out there that do not make zero drop shoes. And so the competition in that space is pretty stiff, where the zero drop space is much smaller. And in my opinion, that's probably why Ultra thrived in that space for quite some time. The other complaint I've heard about Ultra recently is that some of their shoes are not as spacious as they used to be. Like the toe box isn't quite as wide. And I have to say I've noticed it on some of my latest shoes. So I've gotten a pair of Torin 6s, and definitely around the midfoot, they're a little tight. I had to really loosen up the laces to get them not to push too hard on the top of my foot. The actual toe box was wide enough, though. I didn't really have any issues with that. I also got a pair of Escalante racers recently, and kind of the same thing. The midfoot felt a little tight to me. And keep in mind that I've always wore size 10 for ultras. I mean, that has always worked for me. So yes, I could possibly bump up a half size, but then I feel like the shoe would be too long, because size 10 is about the right length for me. So, but it turns out both of those pairs of shoes, those Torin 6s and the Escalante racers, once I broke them in, they seem to be doing well, even though I feel like they don't fit quite as good as some of their older models. So another question that comes up is, are zero drop shoes better for you or aren't they? When Ultra started making them, the implication, I don't know if it was actually stated in their marketing material, but at least there was a suggestion made that it may prevent injuries. But there's been a good many studies done, and I don't have a bunch of them to cite, but you can search for yourself. And what I've seen is that most of the studies have been inconclusive. They haven't proven that it's been an improvement when it comes to preventing injuries, and there hasn't really been much to say that it causes injuries either. So it seems like wearing zero drop shoes doesn't necessarily, if you believe the studies, doesn't necessarily have a benefit as far as injury prevention. So I guess it comes down to what's right for your foot, whether zero drop works for you or non-zero drop. Now, recently I actually read an article written by a podiatrist, and he feels like zero drop shoes actually are causing injury. He mentioned that there's a lot of people coming into his practice that have had issues with calves or Achilles tendons or something like that, and a lot of them he feels have to do with them wearing zero drop shoes. And I certainly can't discredit this guy. Again, I wish I had the article to cite, but I looked for it. I couldn't find it again. It wasn't too long ago that I read it. So I'm certainly not going to say that this guy is wrong. He obviously knows what he sees when people come through the door of his practice. I guess a couple questions I would like to ask a person who's seeing that, though, is, are those people wearing zero drop shoes for the first time? Because it seems to me when you first start wearing them is when you would likely start to have issues, especially if you started wearing them and switched to them and started racing or running fast right away. I could see that being a recipe for problems if you don't work into them slowly and get used to them. The other thing I wonder is if those people who had the injuries wore zero drop shoes elsewhere, or if they wore shoes that did have a drop for everything else and just wore zero drop shoes for running. I would feel like that might be an issue too. Again, not speaking from experience, but it just seems to me that if you want to get your calves and your feet used to zero drop shoes, you need to wear zero drop shoes often enough that they become accustomed to it. But that's just my 2 cents worth. I'd be curious to know your opinions and what experiences you've had, so put those in the comments below. If you have any questions for me about the shoes that I wear or what my experience has been with them, feel free to leave a comment about that too. As always, thanks for watching this episode, and we'll see you next time.